Deep beneath the Sea of Okhotsk, the USS Halibut sat motionless in absolute darkness. Outside the hull, the water pressure reached 600 pounds per square inch. Inside, 23 men breathed recycled air and listened to the faint hum of Soviet naval traffic passing overhead. Commander Whitey Mack held a finger to his lips, unnecessary, but instinctive. His sonar operator had just identified something impossible, a communications cable, lying on the ocean floor in international waters, carrying encrypted Soviet Pacific Fleet transmissions directly to Moscow. The cable wasn't supposed to exist. Intelligence had predicted it would run through shallow coastal waters, protected by minefields and patrol boats. Instead, it stretched across the deep seabed, unguarded, pulsing with the Soviet Union's most sensitive military secrets. Mack looked at the cable's coordinates on the navigation chart, then at his executive officer. Neither man spoke. They both understood what this meant. Either the greatest intelligence opportunity of the Cold War, or a trap so sophisticated it hadn't been conceived yet. The Halibut had 90 seconds to decide. Then, the Soviet destroyer overhead would complete its patrol arc and turn back. This is the story of the secret U.S. submarine that tapped the Soviets' deepest military cable and got away with it. The year was 1971. The Cold War had calcified into a permanent state of technological paranoia. The Soviet Union and the United States faced each other across an ideological abyss, each possessing enough nuclear weapons to end civilization several times over. But the true battlefield wasn't in the silos or the bomber bases. It was in the silence between them. Intelligence collection had become the primary weapon. The side that could see without being seen and hear without being heard would win without firing a shot. The USS Halibut was not a typical submarine. Originally commissioned in 1960 as the Navy's first nuclear-powered guided missile submarine, she had been repurposed in 1968 for a mission so classified that most of the Pentagon didn't know it existed. Her missile bay had been converted into a hangar for a deep-sea submersible called Fish, a remotely operated vehicle equipped with cameras, manipulator arms, and sensors designed to operate at crushing depths. The Halibut's official designation was Special Projects Submarine. Her actual mission was espionage. Commander James Bradley Whitey Mack had been handpicked to lead this operation. At 42, he was a career submariner with a reputation for mathematical precision and emotional restraint. He had served in the Pacific during the final months of World War II, survived the transition to nuclear propulsion, and spent years studying Soviet naval doctrine. He understood that submarine warfare was fundamentally about patience, the ability to remain invisible while the enemy exhausted himself searching. The operation had begun 6 months earlier in a windowless briefing room at the Office of Naval Intelligence in Suitland, Maryland. Mack and 3 other officers sat across from 2 men in civilian clothes who introduced themselves only as advisors from the agency. The briefing lasted 11 minutes. The advisors explained that Soviet Pacific Fleet communications had become impenetrable. Encryption had improved. Radio intercepts provided nothing useful. But the Soviets had made one miscalculation. They believed underwater cables in international waters were technologically inaccessible. The Navy was about to prove them wrong. Mack asked one question: what happens if we're detected? The advisors exchanged a glance. One of them said, "You won't be." The other added, "But if you are, the mission never happened. You were conducting routine hydrographic surveys. The equipment in your hold doesn't exist." The Halibut departed Pearl Harbor on August 3, 1971, under the cover story of a scientific expedition to map volcanic formations. She carried a crew of 147 men, though only 23 knew the real mission. The rest believed they were supporting oceanographic research. The submarine traveled north through the Pacific, running deep and silent, avoiding commercial shipping lanes. After 9 days, she entered the Sea of Okhotsk through the Kuril Islands Passage, slipping between Soviet sonar nets during a storm that degraded detection capabilities. The Sea of Okhotsk is a cold, deep marginal sea bordered by Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula and the Kuril Islands. In 1971, it was effectively a Soviet lake. Soviet patrol boats, destroyers, and submarines operated freely. The Soviet Pacific Fleet used it for weapons testing, submarine trials, and secure communications. No American vessel had penetrated this far into Soviet-controlled waters and returned. The risk was absolute. For 3 weeks, the halibut crept across the seabed at depths ranging from 300 to 400 feet, moving at 2 knots, barely faster than a human walks. Sonar contact with Soviet vessels occurred daily, sometimes hourly. Each time, the halibut would shut down all non-essential systems, drift, and wait. The crew existed in a state of suspended tension. Conversations dropped to whispers. Meals were eaten cold to avoid generating heat signatures. Sleep came in 30-minute intervals. Then, on August 29th, the sonar operator detected something unusual, a faint electromagnetic signature emanating from the seabed. It was consistent with high-voltage current flow, exactly what a long-distance communications cable would emit. Mac ordered the halibut to full stop. He summoned the executive officer, the chief engineer, and the mission commander, a civilian intelligence officer named Dr. John Arnold. They gathered around the sonar display. Arnold confirmed it. This was the cable. The halibut positioned herself directly above the cable's projected location. The crew launched Fish, the submersible, from the hangar bay. Tethered to the submarine by a fiber-optic umbilical, Fish descended through the darkness, its lights cutting narrow cones through sediment and plankton. At 400 feet, the cameras captured it, a black cylindrical cable, about 4 inches in diameter, resting on the ocean floor like a sleeping serpent. It was unburied, unprotected, and live. Dr. Arnold studied the feed. He explained that tapping the cable would require attaching an inductive sensor, a device that could detect the electromagnetic pulses transmitted through the cable without physically breaching it. The technology was experimental. It had been tested in controlled environments, but never at operational depth, never in hostile waters, and never with Soviet destroyers patrolling overhead. Failure meant detection. Success meant access to the Soviet Union's naval nerve center. Mac asked how long the installation would take. Arnold estimated 6 hours, 2 to position Fish precisely, 3 to attach the sensor pod, and 1 to verify signal capture and retract. 6 hours hovering motionless in Soviet-controlled waters. 6 hours during which any patrol boat could stumble across them. Mac looked at the chronometer. It was 0340 hours. The next Soviet patrol would pass overhead at 0800. They had 4 hours and 20 minutes. He gave the order, proceed. Fish maneuvered into position 6 feet above the cable. The manipulator arms extended, gripping a cylindrical device the size of a propane tank. The sensor pod was wrapped in sound-absorbing foam and weighted with ballast to prevent drift. Arnold monitored the installation from a control station inside the halibut, guiding Fish's operators through each step. The process was excruciating. Every movement had to be precise. Too much force would damage the cable, triggering a fault alarm in Petropavlovsk. Too little would result in poor signal capture, rendering the operation useless. 30 minutes into the installation, the sonar operator reported a new contact, surface vessel, bearing 045 degrees, range 12 miles, closing at 8 knots. Classification, Riga-class frigate, Soviet Navy. Mac absorbed the information without expression. He asked for an intercept projection. The sonar operator calculated 18 minutes. Mac looked at Arnold. Arnold shook his head. They weren't finished. The sensor pod was only half attached. Aborting now meant losing everything. Mac ordered the halibut to reduce depth by 20 feet, increasing the distance from the surface contact while maintaining position over the cable. The maneuver was risky. It brought them closer to the thermocline layer where sonar detection improved. But it bought time. The crew worked in silence, their faces illuminated by instrument panels and red emergency lights. The only sounds were the whisper of ventilation and the occasional hydraulic hiss as Fish adjusted its position. At the 8-minute mark, the sonar operator reported a second contact, Soviet submarine, Foxtrot class, bearing 270 degrees, range 9 miles, depth unknown. Mac felt his pulse slow, a physiological response he'd trained himself to cultivate under stress. 2 Soviet vessels converging on their position could be coincidence. It could also be a coordinated response to an anomaly detected by underwater sensors. He had no way to know. He asked the executive officer for status. The XO checked with Arnold. Sensor pod was 80% secured, signal verification in progress. Estimated time to completion, 12 minutes. The surface frigate would pass directly overhead in 10. Mac did the math. He looked at the depth gauge, the sonar display, and the cable feed. Then he made a decision that violated every protocol in the submarine warfare manual. They would hold position. If the frigate detected them, they'd have 40 seconds to release fish, flood ballast, and dive. If the submarine detected them, they'd have no time at all. 9 minutes. The frigate's propeller noise grew louder, a rhythmic thumping that resonated through the hull. The crew could feel it in their chests. Some men closed their eyes. Others stared at the overhead pipes, tracing the welds with their gaze, anything to anchor their minds. Max stood motionless at the periscope station, hands behind his back, watching the sonar display. He appeared calm. Inside, he was calculating probabilities, thermal layer density, sound propagation speed, detection thresholds. The numbers gave him something to hold on to. 8 minutes. Arnold reported signal lock confirmed. The sensor pod was receiving data, but it hadn't been fully secured yet. The locking clamps needed another 90 seconds to engage. Without them, the pod could drift or detach, leaving evidence of American presence. Mac didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The decision had already been made. 7 minutes. The Foxtrot-class submarine altered course, now bearing 285 degrees. It was moving away. Mac allowed himself one shallow breath. The submarine had been transiting, not searching. One variable eliminated. The frigate remained the primary threat. 6 minutes. The sonar operator's voice dropped to a whisper, frigate passing overhead. Range 1,000 yards. Bearing steady. Mac could hear the destroyer's sonar now. Active pings, sharp and metallic, sweeping the water column. The halibut was running silent, but silence wasn't invisibility. If the frigate deployed a dipping sonar or adjusted its ping frequency, they'd light up like a flare. 5 minutes. Arnold's voice crackled over the intercom. Pod secured. Initiating retraction. Fish began its ascent, moving slowly to avoid creating a pressure wake. The manipulator arms folded against its body. The lights extinguished. It rose through the darkness like a ghost returning to its grave. For minutes, the frigate's engine noise began to fade. It was moving past them, continuing its patrol route. Mac checked the sonar display, bearing 055 degrees, range 1,400 yards, increasing. They'd been missed. Or ignored. The distinction didn't matter. 3 minutes. Fish locked into the hangar bay. The deck crew secured the submersible and sealed the hatch. Arnold confirmed data transmission. The sensor pod was online, feeding encrypted signals back to a floating relay buoy the halibut would deploy on its exit route. The operation was complete. Mac ordered the halibut to come about to heading 270 degrees, depth 350 feet, speed 3 knots. They would withdraw slowly and silently, retracing their entry route through the Kuriil Passage. The return journey would take 11 days. No one spoke. The crew understood that operational success meant nothing if they were detected during exfiltration. Over the following days, the halibut moved through the Sea of Okhotsk like a predator leaving a kill site, cautiously, deliberately, always listening. Soviet naval activity continued around them. Patrol boats, submarines, helicopter overflights. Twice, the halibut detected Soviet diesel submarines conducting ASW drills less than 5 miles away. Each time, Mac ordered a full stop, allowing the halibut to drift with the current while Soviet active sonar swept overhead. The crew existed in a state of hypervigilance, every nerve ending tuned to the possibility of detection. On September 4th, the halibut cleared the Kuriil Passage and entered open Pacific waters. Mac surfaced briefly to deploy the relay buoy, a small, innocuous-looking device that would intercept transmissions from the seabed sensor pod and relay them to a U.S. signals intelligence satellite. The buoy was designed to self-destruct if tampered with, leaving no forensic evidence. Once deployed, the halibut submerged and set course for Pearl Harbor. The journey home took 8 days. The crew still didn't know what they'd accomplished. Mac maintained operational security, informing only the senior officers that the mission had been successful. The rest of the crew continued their routines, performing maintenance, standing watch, sleeping in cramped racks. Some suspected they'd done something significant. Most assumed they'd collected geological samples and returned home. On September 12th, the halibut tied up at Pearl Harbor. No ceremony, no debriefing. Mac and Dr. Arnold were escorted to a secure facility and sequestered for 6 days. The rest of the crew was granted shore leave with explicit orders not to discuss the mission. Within a week, the halibut was reassigned to routine patrol duties. The operation was classified top secret/special access required, its details restricted to fewer than 30 individuals in the U.S. government. And deep beneath the Sea of Okhotsk, the sensor pod continued to listen. For 18 months, the sensor pod operated flawlessly. It intercepted thousands of Soviet naval communications, submarine deployment orders, missile test schedules, readiness assessments, maintenance logs, personnel transfers. The intelligence windfall was unprecedented. The National Security Agency established a dedicated analysis cell to process the data. Entire Soviet operational procedures were reconstructed. Weaknesses were identified. Contingency plans were drafted. But intelligence collection is never static. Success breeds expansion. In early 1973, the Office of Naval Intelligence authorized a second operation. The halibut would return to the Sea of Okhotsk to service the sensor pod, replace its batteries, and retrieve the stored data physically. The pod's internal memory contained recordings of Soviet communications that were too sensitive to transmit via the relay buoy. The NSA wanted them. Commander Mack objected. Returning to the same location violated basic tradecraft. The Soviets weren't blind. They monitored their own waters. A second intrusion increased the probability of detection exponentially. But the intelligence value outweighed the risk, or so the decision-makers in Washington believed. Mack was ordered to prepare for a return mission. The halibut departed Pearl Harbor for the second time in June 1973. This time, the crew knew what they were doing. Operational security was tighter, but morale was lower. Submariners are superstitious. Repeating a successful mission felt like tempting fate. Mack sensed the unease, but said nothing. His job was to execute orders, not validate feelings. The transit north was uneventful. The halibut entered the Sea of Okhotsk on June 28th, using the same Kuril passage. Soviet naval activity had increased since the previous year. More patrols, more sophisticated sonar nets, more aggressive ASW exercises. Mack adjusted his approach, moving slower, deeper, using thermal layers to mask the halibut's acoustic signature. It took 4 days to reach the cable site. When they arrived, Mack ordered fish deployed. The sensor pod was intact. Its status lights blinked green, operational and recording. Dr. Arnold supervised the retrieval process. Fish descended, attached a secondary umbilical to the pod, and began uploading data directly to the halibut's storage banks. The process was estimated to take 90 minutes. Max settled into the familiar rhythm of waiting. 40 minutes into the data transfer, the sonar operator reported a contact. Submarine, classification unknown, bearing 110 degrees, range 6 miles, closing slowly. Mac asked for acoustic analysis. The sonar operator listened, filtering out ambient noise, isolating the contact signature. After 30 seconds, he looked up. Victor-class nuclear submarine, Soviet Navy, running at depth 300 feet, speed 6 knots. Victor-class submarines were new, fast, quiet, and equipped with advanced sonar. This wasn't a coincidence. Mac asked for a course projection. The sonar operator calculated. The Victor would pass within 2 miles of their position in approximately 22 minutes. Mac looked at Arnold. Arnold shook his head. The data transfer was only halfway complete. Aborting now meant losing the intelligence and leaving the sensor pod vulnerable to discovery. Mac made a decision. They would continue the transfer and attempt to evade detection through superior silence. He ordered the halibut to shut down all non-essential systems, environmental control, galley equipment, even the ambient lighting. The crew switched to red battle lamps. The temperature inside the submarine began to drop as the heating system went offline. Men pulled on extra layers, their breath visible in the cold air. 18 minutes. The Victor continued its approach, steady and methodical. Its sonar was passive, listening, not pinging. That gave the halibut an advantage. Passive sonar required sustained contact to achieve a firing solution. If the halibut remained silent, the Victor might pass without detecting them. Might. 15 minutes. Arnold reported the data transfer at 70% completion. Estimated time remaining, 12 minutes. Mac did the math. The Victor would arrive before the transfer finished. He had 3 options: abort the transfer and withdraw immediately, continue the transfer and hope for the best, or release fish and attempt to distract the Victor while the halibut withdrew. None of the options were good. He chose the second: continue and hope. 12 minutes. The Victor's bearing remained constant, which meant it was either headed directly toward them or tracking a parallel course. Mac couldn't determine which without active sonar. An active sonar would give away their position. He stood at the plotting table, watching the contact icon creep closer on the display. The executive officer stood beside him, saying nothing. There was nothing to say. 10 minutes. One of the crew members in the forward torpedo room coughed, a short, reflexive sound. The chief of the boat shot him a look that could melt steel. The man clamped a hand over his mouth, his eyes wide. Every man in the room held his breath. Sound traveled through water with terrifying efficiency. A cough, a dropped wrench, even a loud heartbeat could be detected by sensitive sonar. 8 minutes. Arnold reported 85% completion. 8 more minutes. The Victor was now 4 miles away, still closing. Mac calculated intercept time, 9 minutes. They were going to overlap. The question was whether the Victor's sonar operators were good enough to detect the halibut through the ambient noise of the ocean. 6 minutes. The sonar operator's voice broke the silence. Contact has slowed. New speed estimated at 3 knots. Mac processed the information. A reduction in speed meant the Victor was either conducting a sonar sweep or preparing to change course. If it was sweeping, they were about to be found. 5 minutes. The halibut's hull groaned softly, a sound submariners call hull popping, caused by pressure differentials as the submarine adjusted its depth. It was unavoidable, physics asserting itself. The sound was faint, barely audible inside the submarine, but to a trained sonar operator listening with headphones, it would stand out like a bell. For minutes, the sonar operator's voice again, quieter now. Contact has altered course. New bearing 120 degrees. Mac felt a flicker of hope. The Victor was turning away. Either it hadn't detected them, or it had detected something else and was investigating. Either way, they had time. 3 minutes. Arnold. Transfer complete. Fish is retracting. Mac exhaled slowly. The crew waited as fish ascended, locked into the hangar bay, and sealed. The moment the hatch clanged shut, Mac ordered ahead slow, course 280 degrees, depth 400 feet. The halibut began to move, creeping away from the cable site. 2 minutes. The Victor was now 5 miles away, moving on a diverging course. Mac allowed systems to come back online gradually. Heating first, then environmental control, then galley equipment. The crew resumed normal operations, but the tension remained. They weren't safe yet. They wouldn't be safe until they cleared Soviet waters. The withdrawal took 9 days. Soviet ASW activity intensified during the final 72 hours, forcing the halibut to adjust her route repeatedly. Twice, Mac was forced to sit motionless on the seabed while Soviet destroyers conducted overhead searches. On September 8th, the halibut finally cleared the Kuril Passage and entered international waters. Mac surfaced briefly, transmitted a coded signal to naval intelligence, and set course for Pearl Harbor. They arrived on September 16, 1973. This time, there was no debriefing. Mac and Arnold were flown directly to Washington, D.C., and escorted to Fort Meade, Maryland, headquarters of the National Security Agency. They were led into a secure vault and shown the results of their mission. Detailed transcripts of Soviet naval communications, operational plans, submarine patrol routes, contingency war orders. The intelligence had already been disseminated to the Joint Chiefs, the CIA, and the White House. It was being used to inform strategic planning, arms control negotiations, and crisis response protocols. An NSA deputy director thanked them. He said the operation had fundamentally altered the balance of the Cold War. Then he reminded them that they could never speak of it. Not to their families, not to their colleagues, not to historians. The operation was classified top secret/special compartmented information, restricted indefinitely. Mac nodded. He understood. Secrecy was the price of success. He returned to Pearl Harbor and resumed his career. He never discussed the mission again. The Halibut conducted 5 more missions to the Sea of Okhotsk between 1974 and 1981. Each time, the crew serviced the sensor pod, replaced batteries, and retrieved data. The operation, codenamed Ivy Bells, became one of the longest-running and most successful intelligence collection programs of the Cold War. The NSA estimated that the intercepts provided strategic intelligence equivalent to a decade of satellite reconnaissance. But all secrets have a shelf life. In 1980, an NSA analyst named Ronald Pelton, facing financial difficulties and disillusionment with his career, walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and offered to sell classified information. Over the next 5 years, Pelton provided the KGB with details of multiple U.S. intelligence operations. Among them was Ivy Bells. He described the cable, the sensor pod, the Halibut's missions, everything. The Soviets responded with calculated restraint. They didn't remove the sensor pod immediately. That would have revealed they'd been compromised. Instead, they allowed the pod to remain operational, feeding it a mixture of genuine and fabricated communications. The NSA continued to collect intelligence, unaware that it was being manipulated. In 1981, the Soviets quietly retrieved the pod during a routine maintenance inspection of the cable. They analyzed its design, reverse-engineered its components, and displayed it publicly at a press conference in Moscow, accusing the United States of espionage. The revelation was a catastrophic intelligence failure. Years of strategic planning based on Ivy Bell's data had to be re-evaluated. Trust within the intelligence community eroded. Pelton was eventually arrested in 1985, tried for espionage, and sentenced to life in prison. He served 28 years before being released in 2015. Commander Mack learned of the compromise in 1982 during a classified briefing at the Pentagon. He sat in silence as officials explained how Pelton's betrayal had unraveled the operation. Mack didn't react. He'd spent his career in a world where success was invisible and failure was catastrophic. He understood that espionage was temporary, a race against time, technology, and human weakness. Ivy Bells had lasted a decade. That was longer than most operations survived. He retired from the Navy in 1983 with the rank of Rear Admiral. His service record contained no mention of Ivy Bells. The medals he received were generic, their citations vague. At his retirement ceremony, a fellow officer remarked that Mack had served with distinction but without fanfare. Mack smiled politely and said nothing. He moved to a small town in Virginia, far from the coast, and lived quietly. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't give interviews. When journalists occasionally tracked him down and asked about his career, he offered polite deflections and changed the subject. The few people who knew the truth, former crew members, intelligence officers, NSA analysts, honored the same silence. Operational security persisted even in retirement. Mack died in 2006 at the age of 77. His obituary in the Washington Post mentioned his naval service and his contributions to submarine warfare, but included no specifics. The Halibut was decommissioned in 1976 and eventually scrapped. The sensor pod retrieved by the Soviets was displayed briefly in a Moscow museum, then disappeared into storage. The cable beneath the Sea of Okhotsk was rerouted and upgraded with modern encryption. The legacy of Ivy Bells remained classified until 1998, when portions of the operation were declassified following the end of the Cold War. Even then, many details remained redacted. The full story, the decisions, the risks, the human moments of doubt and courage remained locked in classified archives, accessible only to those with the appropriate clearances. But among submariners, a quiet respect endured. The men who served on the Halibut rarely spoke of the mission, even to each other. But they remembered. They remembered the silence, the cold, the weight of responsibility. They remembered holding their breath in the darkness while Soviet destroyers passed overhead. They remembered the moment the sensor pod locked into place, the quiet satisfaction of a mission completed. And they remembered Commander Mack, standing motionless at the periscope station, calm and precise, making decisions that would alter the course of history. Years later, one former crew member was asked what he remembered most about the mission. He thought for a long time before answering. Finally, he said, "The silence. We lived in silence, we worked in silence, and we left in silence. And when we got home, we stayed silent. That's the job." The Cold War ended not with an explosion, but with a sigh, a slow exhale of tension accumulated over 40 years. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, its empire fragmenting into independent states, its military rusting in port, its secrets spilling into the light. The ideological conflict that had defined a generation simply stopped. The silence that followed felt unnatural, like the absence of a sound you didn't realize you'd been hearing. Ivy Bells was one thread in a vast tapestry of clandestine operations conducted by both sides during the Cold War. The United States tapped cables, intercepted communications, and infiltrated Soviet facilities. The Soviets did the same. Both sides deployed submarines into hostile waters, risking detection and confrontation. Both sides lived with the possibility that a miscalculation, a malfunction, or a moment of poor judgment could trigger a war that would end civilization. And yet, the war never came. Historians debate why. Some credit nuclear deterrence, the mutual understanding that any conflict would be suicidal. Others point to diplomacy, the slow grinding work of treaties and summits. But there's another explanation, quieter and less satisfying. The Cold War remained cold because of operations like Ivy Bells. Intelligence collection provided clarity. Clarity reduced fear. And reduced fear meant fewer miscalculations. Commander Mack understood this. He never believed he was a hero. He believed he was a technician, executing a mission with precision and discipline. But in doing so, he helped maintain the fragile equilibrium that prevented catastrophe. The sensor pod beneath the Sea of Okhotsk was a tool, nothing more. But tools, in the right hands, can change the world. Today, the Sea of Okhotsk is silent again. The Soviet Pacific Fleet no longer patrols its waters. The communication cables have been upgraded, rerouted, and encrypted with technology that makes physical interception obsolete. The halibut is gone, her hull cut apart in a shipyard decades ago. The men who served aboard her are aging, their numbers dwindling each year. Soon, there will be no one left who remembers. But the ocean remembers. For 100 feet beneath the surface, in the cold and the darkness, the imprint of those operations remains. A faint electromagnetic signature, perhaps. A trace of metal in the sediment. Echoes of sonar pings, refracted through water and time. Peace, it seems, was maintained not by strength, but by silence. The submarines that slipped through hostile waters, undetected and unacknowledged, carried the weight of restraint. They could have triggered war. Instead, they prevented it. That is their legacy. Not the intelligence they collected, but the catastrophe they helped avoid. And every so often, somewhere in the deep Pacific, a sonar ping echoes in the dark, a reminder that the true victories of the Cold War were the battles that never happened. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more forgotten moments from the Cold War. And tell me, do you think this encounter could have ended differently?